Good evening, and welcome back to Boring History to Sleep. Tonight, I'd like you to get comfortable, pull the blanket a little closer, because we're about to spend the winter somewhere that makes even the coldest modern morning feel surprisingly welcoming. Now, imagine you wake up before dawn, except there isn't really a dawn. Not today, not tomorrow, and not for what feels like an eternity. Outside your wooden longhouse, the world has almost disappeared. Snow has buried the familiar paths between neighboring farms. The fjord is wrapped in a pale gray silence. The wind whistles through the pine trees with a voice that almost sounds human. For a moment, you wonder whether the sun simply forgot where you live. Inside the longhouse, things aren't much brighter. A fire burns slowly in the center of the room. It gives warmth, but not without a price. Thick smoke curls lazily toward the roof before drifting back down into the crowded living space. Your eyes sting, your throat feels dry. Every piece of clothing you own smells faintly of soot. If modern people complain about their smoke detector beeping for 30 seconds, imagine voluntarily living inside the smoke itself for nearly half the year. Around you, children are still sleeping beneath heavy wool blankets. An elderly woman quietly mends a torn cloak beside the fire. Someone stirs yesterday's barley porridge back to life. A dog barely lifts its head. Even the sheep seem too tired to complain. No one is in a hurry. There is nowhere to go. Nothing grows outside. The sea is dangerous. The forests are silent. Winter has paused the entire world. When most of us picture Vikings, we imagine roaring warriors charging into battle, axes raised, ships cutting through crashing waves, beards dramatically flowing in the wind like they're starring in the most expensive historical TV series ever made. But battles, surprisingly, were not what frightened many Vikings the most. Winter was, not because it was dramatic, but because it was patient. It didn't need an army, or a sword, or an enemy ship appearing on the horizon. It simply arrived, closed every road, darkened every sky, consumed every stored meal, one day at a time. There were no supermarkets waiting just over the hill, no weather forecasts promising warmer temperatures next week, no electric lights to chase away the darkness, and certainly no delivery driver bringing hot soup to your front door. Winter didn't care how brave you were. It asked a much simpler question. Did you prepare well enough to survive? Because surviving a Viking winter wasn't about winning glorious battles. It was about enduring endless nights, breathing smoky air, sharing cramped spaces with family and livestock, protecting precious food supplies, and waking each morning hoping spring hadn't forgotten your village. So tonight, let's leave behind the legends of fearless raiders for a little while. Instead, let's step inside an ordinary Viking home. Let's sit beside the fire, listen to the wind outside, watch the smoke drift through the rafters, and discover why the greatest enemy a Viking ever faced wasn't another clan. It was the long, silent, unforgiving winter. Now, before we step inside the Viking longhouse, let's stand outside for just a moment. Not because it's comfortable, quite the opposite. Because unless you've experienced a northern winter yourself, it's almost impossible to imagine how profoundly darkness can change a person's world. Picture yourself standing on the rocky coast of Norway, sometime around the 9th century. The sea lies before you like a sheet of black glass. The mountains rise behind you, their peaks disappearing beneath thick blankets of snow. The air bites the inside of your nose every time you breathe. The wind carries tiny crystals of ice that sting your face like handfuls of sand. And above all, there is darkness. Not the darkness of midnight, not the comforting darkness before bedtime, a different kind. A darkness that lingers long after you've slept. A darkness that greets you when you wake. A darkness that quietly convinces you it has no intention of leaving. Modern people often say winter days feel short. For many Vikings, some days barely seem to begin at all. Depending on where they lived, daylight during the deepest weeks of winter could last only a few precious hours. the sun would crawl reluctantly above the horizon, never climbing very high, before disappearing once again behind mountains and clouds. Sometimes, the sky never became truly bright. Instead, morning simply faded into a dim gray twilight, then twilight slipped back into night. If your smartphone automatically switched to dark mode, congratulations! You've recreated approximately 1% of the Viking experience. This lack of sunlight wasn't merely inconvenient, it shaped every decision a family made. Without bright daylight, there was less time for outdoor work, fishing became more dangerous. Travel slowed dramatically, repairs were postponed, children stayed indoors, animals remained sheltered whenever possible. Even gathering firewood became a careful calculation between necessity and risk. One wrong step across hidden ice, one unexpected snowstorm, one broken ankle could threaten an entire household. Winter rewarded caution, not bravery. The Viking sagas celebrate fearless warriors. Real life often celebrated the person wise enough not to wander into a blizzard alone. Sometimes the greatest act of courage was admitting today simply wasn't the day. History rarely writes songs about sensible decisions, which is a shame because sensible decisions kept far more people alive. Inside every settlement, life gradually slowed. Summer had been filled with movement, boats, markets, harvests, construction, trading expeditions, neighbors constantly visiting one another. Winter erased much of that motion. The landscape itself seemed to exhale, then fall asleep. Villages that buzzed with activity only months earlier now became clusters of quiet buildings surrounded by endless snow. Even sounds changed. Snow-absorbed noise. The familiar clatter of tools disappeared. Birdsong became rare. Only the wind remained faithfully employed. Apparently, the wind never takes seasonal holidays. Darkness also played tricks on the human mind. Today, scientists understand that limited sunlight can affect mood, sleep cycles, and energy levels. Many people experience seasonal depression during long winters. The Vikings didn't possess medical textbooks explaining serotonin or circadian rhythms, but they didn't need scientific terminology to recognize how winter felt. They lived it. They noticed how people became quieter, more thoughtful, sometimes more irritable. Children grew restless after weeks indoors. Older people stared silently into the fire. Conversations lasted longer, not because there was exciting news, but because stories helped fill the darkness. Imagine spending weeks without seeing a truly sunny afternoon, without bright green trees, without colorful flowers, without hearing insects buzzing across fields. Your world becomes smaller. Your thoughts often do the opposite. When there is little happening outside, the mind begins wandering inward. That can be comforting. It can also be frightening. Modern people call it overthinking. The Vikings simply called it winter. The long nights transformed storytelling into something essential. When there was little work left to do after sunset, families gathered around the fire. Children leaned against their parents. Grandparents cleared their throats, and stories began. Some spoke of Odin wandering the world, disguised as an old traveler. Others warned about trolls lurking among icy cliffs. Many whispered about Draugr, the restless dead who refused to remain peacefully buried. These weren't merely ghost stories designed to scare children. They gave shape to fears that already existed, because sometimes giving fear a name makes it easier to face. Outside, the wind howled against wooden walls. Inside, someone described monsters living beyond the next mountain. Honestly, that combination probably wasn't ideal for anyone hoping to sleep peacefully. Yet these tales served another purpose. They reminded everyone that darkness eventually ends. Even Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world, was followed by renewal. After destruction came rebirth. After winter, spring. This belief mattered. Hope is easier to preserve when your stories promise that no season lasts forever. The rhythm of daily life adapted accordingly. Families rose when there was enough light to work. Tasks were organized carefully. Every hour of daylight mattered. Clothing needed mending. Fishing nets required repair. Wood had to remain dry. Food stores demanded constant inspection. Even small mistakes carried larger consequences during winter. Spoiled grain, wet firewood, a leaking roof. Problems ignored in summer could become disasters by midwinter. Preparation became almost a form of survival itself. Not glamorous, not heroic, just necessary. People who laughed at careful planning during autumn rarely found winter nearly as amusing. Perhaps this is where modern life feels surprisingly familiar. Today, we prepare by charging our phones before storms, buying extra groceries before heavy snowfall, checking weather forecasts. The Vikings prepared by stacking firewood, drying fish, repairing roofs, and hoping their livestock survived until spring. Different tools, same instinct. Humans have always tried to negotiate with uncertainty. As weeks passed, time itself seemed to change. Without long, sunny days dividing one afternoon from another, the winter months blurred together. Yesterday looked remarkably similar to today. Tomorrow promised more of the same. Snow, smoke, darkness, silence, repeat. Perhaps that's why seasonal festivals became so important. Celebrations interrupted monotony. They reminded people that time was still moving forward, that the sun, although stubbornly absent, had not abandoned the world forever. The Yule season arrived like a warm light in the middle of endless cold. Families gathered. Food was shared carefully. Aloe was poured. Songs echoed beneath smoke-darkened beams. Stories grew louder. Laughter lasted longer. Not because life had suddenly become easy, but because joy feels brightest when surrounded by darkness. The Vikings understood something psychologists would later spend centuries explaining. Community doesn't eliminate hardship. It makes hardship easier to survive. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson hidden inside the endless northern night. The darkness was real. The cold was relentless. The uncertainty never disappeared. But no one faced it entirely alone. Every shared meal, every story, every crackling fire, every familiar face across the room pushed back the darkness just a little farther. Not enough to defeat winter, but enough to survive it. Now, let's finally step inside. At first glance, a Viking longhouse looks exactly like the kind of place you'd want to hide from a brutal winter. Its thick timber walls stand firm against the wind. Its turf-covered roof helps trap precious warmth. The doorway is low. The windows are few. From outside, it almost looks cozy. Almost. Because the moment you duck your head and cross the threshold, your nose immediately tells a very different story. The air is thick, not just warm, heavy, dense. It carries the smell of burning wood, animal hides, wet wool rendered fat, cooking stew, and dozens of human bodies sharing the same enclosed space for weeks at a time. If you've ever walked into a cabin after someone forgot to open the chimney damper, imagine multiplying that feeling by an entire winter. The center of every longhouse was its beating heart. A long fire burned directly on the floor. There was no elegant stone fireplace tucked neatly into one wall. No cast iron stove, no thermostat waiting to be adjusted by a few comfortable degrees. Just an open fire, morning until night, day after day, month after month. It cooked meals. It dried clothing. It warmed frozen hands. It provided light. It became the center around which life revolved. Without it, winter would win within hours, but every blessing carried a cost. The smoke had to go somewhere. Many Viking longhouses had roof openings or simple vents that allowed at least some of the smoke to escape. Yet these openings were intentionally small, too large, and precious heat would vanish into the freezing sky. Too small, and smoke lingered inside. Families constantly balanced warmth against breathable air. Neither option was ideal. Imagine sitting near the fire for hours. Your eyes water. You rub them. A thin gray haze floats beneath the rafters. The smoke stings your throat every time you laugh. Tiny sparks occasionally drift upward before disappearing into darkness. Children barely notice anymore. They've grown up breathing this air. Visitors would notice immediately and probably start coughing before anyone finished saying hello. Modern researchers studying reconstructed Viking longhouses have found that indoor smoke levels could become remarkably high, especially during winter when ventilation remained limited. Over months, that smoke likely irritated lungs, damaged eyes, and contributed to chronic respiratory problems. Ironically, the very fire keeping you alive could slowly make you sick. History has an impressive talent for creating problems that solve other problems. The fire also determined where everyone slept. Benches lined the walls of the longhouse. By day, they served as places to sit, to repair clothing, to carve wood, to share meals. By night, they became beds. Families wrapped themselves in wool blankets, animal furs, whatever insulation they possessed. The closer you slept to the fire, the warmer you remained. The farther away, the colder the night became. Even bedtime had a seating chart. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. Imagine sharing one large room with parents, grandparents, children, visiting relatives, guests, workers, perhaps even travelers seeking shelter from a snowstorm. Someone snores, someone coughs, a baby begins crying, a dog shakes snow from its fur, another log collapses into the fire. Every sound belongs to everyone. Noise had nowhere to hide. If you've ever complained about hearing your neighbor through an apartment wall, a Viking child could probably hear 3 generations arguing over whose turn it was to feed the goats. Speaking of goats, they weren't always outside. Neither were sheep or valuable calves. During particularly harsh weather, some livestock were brought into or kept close to the living quarters for protection. Animals represented wealth, food, future survival. Losing one to freezing temperatures could threaten the household's entire year, so humans and animals often shared the same shelter. Convenient, perhaps. Fragrant, not exactly. The smell inside a winter longhouse was impossible to separate into individual scents. Everything blended together. Fresh-cut timber, damp leather boots drying beside the fire, lanolin from wool clothing, salted fish hanging from beams, boiled cabbage, animal manure, smoke, sweat, wood resin, dog fur. It wasn't one unpleasant odor, it was an entire ecosystem. A modern scented candle company would probably struggle to market it. Essence of 9th century longhouse might not become this season's best seller, yet to the Vikings, these smells meant something different. They meant life. Smoke meant warmth, cooking meant food, animals meant security. Wet wool meant someone had returned safely from outside. The smells we might find overwhelming, they found reassuring. Familiarity has a remarkable ability to soften discomfort. Winter demanded constant work even indoors. Women spun wool into thread. Weavers worked patiently at upright looms. Men repaired tools, sharpened knives, mended fishing equipment. Children learned skills simply by watching. There was no classroom, no instruction manual. Knowledge passed from hands to eyes, from parents to children, one careful movement at a time. The longhouse became a workshop as much as a home. Every spare hour mattered. A torn mitten repaired today might save frostbitten fingers tomorrow. A broken wooden bucket fixed before spring could carry fresh water for another year. Nothing useful was thrown away casually. Everything earned another chance, sometimes another dozen chances. Modern consumers replace, Vikings repaired, repeatedly. Their version of upgrading usually involved adding another patch. Food preparation also filled countless hours. Large iron cauldrons hung above the fire. Stews simmered slowly. Grains softened. Dried fish rehydrated. Bits of preserved meat flavored broths meant to stretch limited supplies. Meals weren't elaborate. They didn't need to be. Calories mattered more than presentation. Nobody was photographing dinner for social media, mostly because cameras wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. As darkness settled each afternoon, The longhouse transformed once again. Work slowed, stories began. Someone picked up a simple instrument, perhaps a lyre, perhaps only their voice. Songs echoed against smoke-darkened beams, polished by generations of firelight. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, people answered with music. Not because they ignored hardship, because music reminded them hardship hadn't won. Even the architecture reflected centuries of practical wisdom. Longhouses were built low to conserve heat. Their thick walls blocked icy winds. Their roofs shed snow remarkably well. Every beam, every support post, every plank represented generations of accumulated experience. No engineering degree, no architectural software, just centuries of trial, error, and survivors quietly teaching the next generation what actually worked. Sometimes, the longhouse felt impossibly crowded. Arguments happened, tempers flared, children became restless, adults grew exhausted. There were undoubtedly moments when someone desperately wished for 5 minutes alone. Unfortunately, winter wasn't accepting reservation requests for private space. Yet despite all its discomforts, the longhouse offered something priceless: safety. Outside waited freezing winds capable of killing within hours, hungry wolves, deep snow, frozen rivers, pitch-black nights. Inside, there was warmth, family, food, conversation, light. Imperfect comfort was infinitely better than perfect exposure. Perhaps that's why archaeologists often describe the Viking longhouse as more than a building. It was the center of an entire world. Births happened there. Meals were shared there. Stories survived there. Children learned there. The elderly passed on memories there. When someone died, their absence was felt there. Every important moment eventually returned to the fire in the center of the room. The longhouse wasn't simply where Vikings lived. It was where Viking life itself continued through each relentless winter. And as long as that fire kept burning, hope remained alive too. Now, let's step away from the warmth of the fire, not because it's safe outside, but because winter had one final lesson for every Viking family. Cold could hurt you, smoke could weaken you, darkness could exhaust your mind. But hunger could end everything. The most dangerous battle of the winter wasn't fought with axes. It was fought with wooden bowls and the quiet arithmetic of survival. Imagine opening the family food chest. Not out of curiosity, out of necessity, you lift the heavy wooden lid. Inside are sacks of barley, some dried peas, a few smoked fish, salted lamb, perhaps a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. It doesn't look like much, because it isn't. Yet every meal for the next several months depends on what sits inside that chest. There will be no emergency trip to the market, no merchant arriving tomorrow with fresh supplies, and certainly no mysterious package left outside your front door by someone wearing a blue delivery uniform. If the food runs out, there is no backup plan. Every autumn had been a race against time. Fields had to be harvested before the first hard frosts. Fish had to be dried, meat had to be smoked or salted, butter had to be churned, cheese had to mature, ale had to be brewed, firewood had to be stacked. Every family worked with a single goal: prepare enough or pay for the mistake all winter. Unlike modern kitchens, where expired yogurt is often thrown away with little thought, a Viking household viewed every preserved scrap of food as stored time. Each smoked fish represented another day of life. Each barrel of grain meant another sunrise. Food wasn't simply nourishment, it was insurance against the future. Of course, no amount of preparation guaranteed success. One poor harvest, a summer drought, heavy rains, disease among livestock, or a fishing season spoiled by violent storms could reduce winter's supplies before winter even began. Nature didn't negotiate, it simply presented the bill. Families quickly learned the value of careful rationing. Large feasts belonged to festivals. Ordinary winter days demanded discipline. Stews became thinner, bread became smaller, portions became carefully measured. No one wanted to discover halfway through February that they had eaten March. Children probably complained. Teenagers were probably convinced they were starving every 15 minutes. Some things never change. Protein came from preserved meats and fish, but fresh food became increasingly rare. Root vegetables stored underground lasted surprisingly well. Turnips, onions, cabbage, sometimes carrots. Dried herbs added flavor whenever available. Yet after weeks of eating similar meals, monotony settled onto the dinner table. Imagine eating variations of the same stew for months. Even the world's greatest chef might eventually surrender. Fishing continued whenever weather allowed, but winter seas were unforgiving. Small boats faced enormous risks: high winds, ice, unpredictable waves. A successful fishing trip brought relief. A failed one wasted precious energy. Sometimes staying home was the wiser decision. Sometimes hunger forced people to gamble anyway. Hunting followed similar rules. Game animals became harder to find. Deep snow slowed hunters. Tracks disappeared beneath fresh snowfall. Cold weather demanded enormous physical effort. A hunter burned valuable calories simply reaching the forest. Failure meant returning home weaker than when he left. Success meant feeding everyone. Every expedition balanced hope against exhaustion. Then there were the animals already living beside the family. Cows, sheep, goats, chickens. They represented future milk, future wool, future offspring. Killing them too early solved today's problem, while creating next year's disaster. Families faced painful choices: protect breeding animals or survive the present. History often remembers dramatic battles. It rarely remembers impossible household decisions. As winter deepened, the human body itself began changing. Heavy labor became slower, muscles tired more quickly. Cold demanded enormous amounts of energy. Simply staying warm consumed calories. Sleeping required calories. Walking through snow required calories. Carrying firewood required even more. Every activity became slightly more expensive. Not in silver, in food. Illness added another layer of danger. A simple fever could have become frightening. A lingering cough spread easily through crowded longhouses. Smoke irritated already vulnerable lungs. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems. Medical knowledge remained limited. Herbal remedies existed. Some genuinely helped. Others relied more heavily on hope. And hope, unfortunately, has never been particularly effective against pneumonia. The Vikings respected skilled healers. Women especially preserved generations of practical medical knowledge. They knew which plants eased pain, which herbs reduced inflammation, which poultices helped wounds heal. Some treatments worked surprisingly well. Others belonged more comfortably beside folklore than medicine. Still, when someone you loved became ill, you tried everything, because doing something always feels better than doing nothing. Winter also encouraged another kind of hunger, the hunger for certainty. When storms lasted for days, when food stores shrank, when loved ones fell ill, people naturally searched for explanations. Sometimes they found them in religion, sometimes in stories, sometimes in creatures that may never have existed. The forests surrounding Viking settlements became places of imagination as much as geography. Children heard stories about trolls hiding among rocky cliffs, massive beings who disliked sunlight, who wandered the wilderness after dark, who punished careless travelers. Adults understood these tales better than they admitted, because every culture invents monsters suited to its landscape. The Vikings happened to live somewhere that made monsters feel surprisingly believable. Then there were the Draugr. Unlike ordinary ghosts, Draugr were physical, restless dead who refused to remain peacefully buried. According to Norse tradition, these beings guarded treasure, protected burial mounds, or returned to trouble the living. They possessed enormous strength. Some could change shape, others spread fear simply by appearing. Whether anyone truly encountered one is another question entirely. But after weeks of darkness, with the wind rattling wooden walls, almost any strange sound became easier to imagine. Have you ever heard your house creak at 3 in the morning, then immediately convinced yourself someone was walking downstairs? Congratulations! You and a Viking farmer share more psychological similarities than either of you might expect. Winter amplified every uncertainty. A shadow lasted longer. A distant howl sounded closer. A branch scraping the roof suddenly resembled fingers. Human imagination fills empty spaces remarkably efficiently, especially when those spaces remain dark for 16 hours a day. Yet fear wasn't entirely irrational. Real wolves sometimes approached settlements. Hungry bears occasionally wandered too close. Snowstorms erased familiar paths. Ice concealed dangerous rivers beneath deceptively smooth surfaces. The natural world supplied enough genuine threats without needing supernatural assistance. Still, stories helped organize fear. It's easier to explain danger when it wears a face. The Norse gods also played an important role during winter. Odin represented wisdom and sacrifice. Thor protected both gods and ordinary people from chaos. Freyr promised fertility and future harvests. Offerings and seasonal rituals reminded communities that they weren't facing hardship alone. Faith couldn't shorten winter, but it could strengthen those enduring it. Sometimes, that made all the difference. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the days began changing. Not dramatically, just enough. One morning, someone noticed the sun lingering a little longer above the horizon. Another afternoon, the light reached slightly farther into the longhouse doorway. Children noticed first, then adults. Hope rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes, it returns one extra minute of daylight at a time. And after months spent counting food, breathing smoke, listening to storms, and wondering whether spring would ever come, those few additional moments of sunlight felt richer than any treasure carried home from distant raids. Because every Viking eventually learned the same quiet truth. The hardest victories were rarely won on battlefields. Sometimes, they were won simply by surviving one more winter until the light came back. Now, we've spent the night learning how an ordinary Viking family survived the long northern winter. But history becomes even more fascinating when we follow the life of one person. Someone who actually walked through those frozen landscapes. Someone whose words survived for more than 1,000 years. Someone remembered not only for swinging a sword, but for revealing what it felt like to carry unbearable sorrow. His name was Egil Skallagrimsson. If you've never heard of him before, don't worry. You're about to meet one of the most remarkable and complicated figures in all of Norse history. Egil was born in Iceland sometime during the early 10th century. From childhood, he seemed destined to become unusual. According to the Icelandic sagas, he was intelligent, sharp-tongued, stubborn beyond reason, and frighteningly quick to anger. The stories describe him composing poetry while still a small boy. They also describe him getting into violent fights before most children today would be trusted to cross the street alone. Modern parenting books would have had an absolute meltdown. His father, Skallagrim, was hardly gentle himself. A powerful settler and blacksmith, he carried the fierce reputation of a man who had little patience for foolishness. Growing up in such a household meant learning difficult lessons early. Strength mattered. Self-control mattered even more, because in a Viking community, a careless word could begin a feud. A careless decision could destroy an entire family. Unlike the romantic image often shown in films, a Viking childhood wasn't constant adventure. Much of it involved work, feeding animals, gathering fuel, repairing tools, learning practical skills, watching adults prepare for another unforgiving winter. Children matured quickly because nature rarely waited for anyone to grow up. Every autumn, the rhythm repeated itself. Firewood stacked higher, fish hung to dry, meat salted, roofs repaired, boats pulled safely ashore. Everyone understood the same silent truth. Winter was coming, not as a surprise, but as an appointment no one could cancel. Imagine Eagle as a teenager, standing outside the family longhouse, his breath turning instantly to mist, the mountains disappearing beneath fresh snow, the sea growing darker every afternoon. He already dreamed of distant voyages, of glory, of songs celebrating his victories. Yet before he could chase those dreams, he first had to survive another Icelandic winter. History often celebrates the spectacular journeys. It quietly forgets the ordinary mornings that made those journeys possible. As Eagle grew older, he became exactly what the sagas promised: a formidable warrior, a skilled sailor, a gifted poet whose verses could earn kings' respect or provoke their anger. His life carried him across Norway, England, and beyond. He fought, negotiated, made allies, made enemies, sometimes on the very same day. Networking looked slightly different in the Viking Age, yet beneath his fearsome reputation, the sagas reveal another man entirely: a father, a husband, a son, a human being capable of astonishing grief. And it is here, far away from the excitement of battle, that winter returns to our story. One of the greatest tragedies of Egil's life came with the death of his beloved son, Bodvar. According to the saga, the young man drowned during a violent storm. The sea, which had provided opportunity throughout Viking life, suddenly became the instrument of devastating loss. When news reached Egil, something inside him broke. He withdrew from everyone. He refused food, refused conversation. He locked himself away, determined to let himself die. Not by sword, not in battle, simply by surrendering to grief. It's a remarkably human reaction. More than 1,000 years separate us from Egil. Yet anyone who has lost someone deeply loved can recognize that crushing silence, that feeling of wondering whether the world should simply stop turning. History sometimes feels distant. Grief never does. For days, his family worried. Friends pleaded with him. Nothing changed. The fierce warrior who had faced kings and enemies without fear could not face his own sorrow. There is an important lesson hidden here. Strength is not the absence of pain. Even legends break. Eventually, his daughter Thorgerdur came to see him. According to the saga, she used wisdom rather than force. She convinced him that if he truly intended to die, then perhaps they should share one final meal together. It was a gentle deception, one born from love. Egil agreed. He ate. A tiny decision, almost insignificant. Yet sometimes survival begins with something that's small. One meal, one conversation, one more sunrise. Then, instead of dying, he did something extraordinary. He composed a poem, one of the greatest poems in Old Norse literature, Sonatoric, The Loss of Sons. It was not a celebration of victory, nor a boast about heroic deeds. It was raw, honest, heartbreaking. Line after line gave voice to sorrow that words could barely contain. Through poetry, Egil accomplished something remarkable. He did not erase his grief. He survived it. Perhaps that is why his story still resonates today. Not because he wielded an axe, not because he sailed across dangerous seas, but because he transformed unbearable suffering into something meaningful. Across centuries, his voice still speaks, quietly, patiently, like a fire burning in the middle of a winter night. Think back to everything we've explored tonight: the endless darkness, the smoke-filled longhouses, the empty food stores, the freezing winds, the constant uncertainty. All of those hardships shaped the Viking world, but none proved as difficult to escape as the storms inside the human heart. Egil survived both, the winter outside and the winter within. There is something deeply comforting about that. History often introduces us to impossible heroes, men and women who appear larger than life. Egil reminds us that even the strongest people sometimes lose hope. Even the bravest can collapse beneath grief. What matters is not whether darkness arrives. It always does. What matters is finding one small reason to face another morning. Perhaps for Egil, that reason became poetry. For another Viking, it may have been family. For someone else, the promise that spring would eventually return. Hope rarely looks the same for everyone, but it has always existed, waiting quietly beneath the weight of winter. As the years passed, Egil grew older. His legendary strength faded. His eyesight weakened. His body carried the scars of countless battles. Yet the poems remained. His memories remained. His resilience remained. Long after swords rusted, words endured. In many ways, that became his greatest victory. So when we imagine Vikings, perhaps we should picture more than roaring warriors charging into battle. Perhaps we should also imagine an aging man sitting beside a crackling fire, snow drifting quietly outside, the room filled with smoke and silence. A poet carefully choosing his next words, not to conquer another kingdom, but simply to make sense of being human. Now, the fire has burned low. The stories have been told. The wooden bowls are nearly empty. Outside, the wind is quieter than it was when we first arrived. Not because winter has suddenly become kind, but because every season, no matter how long, eventually begins to loosen its grip. Imagine stepping outside your longhouse one early morning. You pause for a moment. Something feels different. The air is still cold, cold enough to sting your cheeks, cold enough that your breath still hangs before your face. But there is another feeling, one you haven't noticed in months. Light, real light. The sun rises just a little earlier. It lingers just a little longer. The shadows no longer swallow the entire day. Snow resting upon the rooftops begins to glisten instead of simply sitting beneath a gray sky. Tiny streams of meltwater trickle beneath frozen banks. The world is waking, slowly, patiently, almost cautiously. Around the settlement, people notice the changes long before they speak about them. A child points toward a patch of earth where dark soil has finally appeared. An old shepherd smiles without realizing it. Someone opens the longhouse door and leaves it open for a few extra moments. Fresh air drifts inside. For the first time in weeks, it doesn't feel like an enemy. The animals sense it too. The sheep grow restless. The dogs spend longer outside. Birdsong, absent for what seemed like forever, returns one cautious note at a time. Nature never hurries. It simply remembers the rhythm it has followed for countless generations. The Vikings understood something we often forget. Spring wasn't guaranteed, not emotionally, not practically. Every family that welcomed its return knew someone who hadn't. Some winters claimed neighbors. Others claimed livestock. Some claimed entire harvests before they even began. Survival was never assumed. It was earned, quietly, patiently, one difficult day after another. Perhaps that's why celebrations carried so much meaning. The arrival of warmer days wasn't merely pleasant weather. It was proof that preparation mattered, proof that hope had not been foolish, proof that enduring the darkness had been worth it. Every green shoot pushing through frozen ground whispered the same message. You made it. Modern life looks very different. Most of us don't spend months wondering whether our food stores will last until spring. We don't breathe wood smoke every day simply to stay alive. We rarely measure survival by the height of our firewood pile. Our winters arrive in different forms: deadlines, loss, loneliness, uncertainty, exhaustion. Days when the future seems hidden behind heavy clouds. Moments when getting through the week feels strangely similar to crossing a frozen sea. The scenery has changed. The human experience hasn't. We still search for warmth, not always from a fire, sometimes from another person's kindness. A familiar voice, a shared meal, a quiet conversation, a message arriving exactly when we needed it. Just as the Viking longhouse protected its people from the storm, we too build places of shelter, not always from timber and turf, but from friendship, family, community, and memories that remind us we are not facing life's winters alone. Perhaps that is why stories have survived for so many centuries, long after the axes rusted, long after the ships disappeared beneath the sea, long after the longhouses returned to the earth. The stories remained because every generation recognizes itself in them. Not in the battles, not in the kings, but in the ordinary people trying to endure extraordinary circumstances. A mother stretching one last sack of grain, a father repairing a broken roof before the next snowfall, children laughing despite the cold, an old poet finding the strength to write after unimaginable loss. History remembers empires, but humanity survives because of ordinary people. Tonight, we've traveled through endless darkness. We've sat beside smoky fires, shared crowded longhouses, counted precious stores of food, listened to old legends carried on the northern wind, and followed one remarkable man who discovered that surviving grief required a different kind of courage than surviving battle. In the end, the greatest Viking victory was rarely found on distant shores. It happened here, at home, when another family welcomed another spring. Maybe that's the quiet lesson hidden beneath all those famous tales of fearless warriors. Real courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like getting out of bed on another cold morning, lighting another fire, sharing another meal, telling another story, believing that somewhere beyond the darkness, the light is already making its slow journey back towards you. The Vikings didn't conquer winter. No one could. They simply learned how to live through it, and perhaps that is an even greater achievement. So, as our own journey through the frozen north comes to an end, I hope tonight's story has reminded you that history is filled not only with extraordinary heroes, but with ordinary people who refuse to give up. People who discovered that even the longest night eventually gives way to morning, and that hope, like the returning sun, often arrives so gradually that we don't notice it until suddenly the world feels warm again. Thank you for spending this evening with me. If you enjoyed wandering through the quieter corners of history, I'd love for you to join me again on our next journey. Until then, keep your fire burning, keep your curiosity alive, and remember, no winter lasts forever. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.